Buongiorno, I'm Shaul Bassi from Ca' Foscari University of Venice, where I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities and Social Change and the also coordinator of the brand new master's degree, Laurea Magistrale in Environmental Humanities.
And good morning, everybody from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I'm Serenella Iovino, and I'm professor of Italian Studies and Environmental Humanities at the University of North Carolina here at Chapel Hill.
I'm very pleased to be with Serenella Iovino today because her scholarship has been a true inspiration for our program, for the many ways in which we connect environment and environmental issues with the humanities. And so I would like to start by asking her how she became a very distinguished scholar of environmental humanities and eco-criticism. So a little bit about her intellectual trajectory, starting from Italy and then becoming professor in the US.
Thank you very much, Shaul. You're always very generous with me. When I started studying environmental humanities, we didn't even have the definition of the discipline. The discipline didn't exist, if it is a discipline. So I started being interested in environmental topics at a very early age of my life. So I was born in Naples, or better, I was born around in the Vesuvian area, so the volcanic surroundings of Naples, in a town called Torre Annunziata. And this is also something which I'd like to emphasize, because as also I think it happens with you, who live and work in Venice and are a native Venetian, the place where you are born, where you live, is actually influencing you, because we are talking here about a situatedness of your experience, of your intellectual experience, and living in a place which had and has many environmental problems. First, because so we have an active volcano there. Then, because of course we have problems of pollution and of criminal pollution sometimes. A place where so the building speculation has actually led to a territorial disfigurement. So this also influences you a lot, because landscape is the first experience you have about the environment. And then, of course, I went to the university in Naples, and I studied philosophy, and I was mostly interested in German philosophy of the Goethe side, so the age of Goethe. And you know that in that very period, literature, philosophy, science, and of course nature were very interconnected. So you couldn't really study Goethe without being interested in the world of the plants and animals and geology and even clouds. So everything was actually belonging into the same framework. And of course, this relationship between human and non-human was what really fascinated me. So from Goethe, from the age of Goethe, in fact, I developed an interest in what was going on actually in our time. So I got interested in environmental philosophy. And I discovered accidentally that a field called eco-criticism existed in that was in the around the year 2000, and so a whole world split open in front of me, and I saw that there were many people that were already working in this field of literature and environment. So literature, philosophy, environment. That was actually my start. And I also had a very fortunate meeting with people working for several associations. So one association is ASLE, so the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, which is based here in the US. And accidentally, I happened to be at the foundational conference of the European Association for the Study of Literature, Culture and Environment in 2004 in Münster, in Germany. And so that was a big experience for me, also because I then became the president of this association. And that was really a moment of interconnectedness and conversations with scholars and students that were actually interested in that very field. And so I felt less lonely. And today I can see that actually we are not lonely anymore. And so this takes me to ask you the same question. How did you become interested in the environmental humanities and this fantastic field? You've been a post-colonial scholar, a Shakespeare scholar.
Exactly.
Scholar.
Well, I would echo your answer by saying more or less the same, that I come to the environmental humanities from two different directions, from sort of more professional direction and a sort of more existential direction. So on the one hand, of course, my whole experience of the environment has been shaped by being born and growing up in Venice, and being part of a generation that has seen Venice almost violently transformed by both the situation of the lagoon and of Marghera, and also sort of some family history involved there, and the pressure of over tourism and the gradual but not too gradual transformation of a city as a full-fledged city into a place under severe pressure from, of course, climate change, sea level rise, and many economic and political choices that make a huge impact on the community. On the other hand, as a post-colonialist, I've always been aware of eco-criticism and of the existence of many different strands of literary study in relation to literature. But I think it's really fair to say that I'm a sort of recent convert. I consider myself a recent convert to environmental humanities, because I used to harbor a certain prejudice. I thought that eco-criticism was mostly concerned with literary representations of nature, and I respected that. I had colleagues who worked on that. Having had a kind of peripheral interest in Canadian culture, even though more urban Canadian culture than rural Canadian culture, it was something that really didn't appeal to me. And for many years, I used to kind of cherish a quote from one of my favorite novels, that is Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint, where Philip Roth, where Alex Portnoy says, what I see first in a landscape isn't the flora, it's the fauna, the human opposition, who is screwing and who is getting screwed. So it was a take, greenery I leave to the birds. And that was my take. And it was a prejudice. It was a stereotype. And then reading some writers who have really shaped my understanding, and Amitav Ghosh for sure, and then your work, it was really an eye-opening experience. And the two, let's say, directions met. So now, thanks to the environmental humanities, I think I can read Venice and my landscape through the lens of eco-criticism, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Let me ask you, what is it like to work on this field? We are, as you said, we've just created a new degree in environmental humanities, and as you said, this is not a discipline. This is more like an area of research, is an interdisciplinary endeavor. Perhaps to try to bring this into a better focus, what is it like to work on the environmental humanities in Italy and from Italy, and in and from the US?
Yes, of course. The environmental humanities, as you perfectly know, are a promise more than a reality sometimes. So we try to keep the promise or keep the intention which is behind the promise alive. And this happens, of course, in the US as well as in other places of the world. And it's always difficult to work in the environmental humanities because, of course, in the US or also in other countries, such as, for example, Australia, where the environmental humanities were born, thanks to the work of people like Val Plumwood, for example, and other important scholars. So it's not it's not easy because the academe doesn't acknowledge the environmental humanities as a full-fledged discipline or discourse. But and this, of course, requires from us an extra effort. We have to justify ourselves. We have to explain every time what we are doing. So in the US, perhaps we are a little bit more. There are established centers. There are, of course, famous scholars. I'm thinking of Scott Slovic, for example. I'm thinking of Johnny Adamson, who also works in the environmental justice field. So there are many, of course, many opportunities. The National Endowment for the Humanities, for example, gives many scholarships and fellowships to environmental humanities scholars. But this doesn't mean that it is easier here. It's a little bit easier in terms of academic bureaucracy, because you don't need to be framed into a very rigid discipline in order to teach this discipline. And this is the big difference with Italy. So I think that the environmental humanities master's program that you have opened in Venice first is an absolutely commendable and courageous step. And you're acting as a powerful wedge into the academic reality. You are opening a field at the academic level, which I am sure will bring many good results, not only in the education of future generations of students and therefore of citizens, but also in the academic system. Because if you can do this in Venice, of course, the Ministry for Education in Italy will detect that something is going on. And so I really think that this is a game-changing experience, the one that you are having in Venice and the one that you are inaugurating there. And so, of course, it will be difficult. It will be it's a courageous step, as I said, but we need to be brave. This is a wild world. This is the kind of wilderness. Also, the
that's the kind of
wilderness is a form of wilderness. And if I may go back to what you were saying about post-colonialism and Venice and climate change. So one of the others that influenced the environmental humanities the most is, of course, Amitav Ghosh. And I was blessed when I saw your name in the acknowledgements of Gun Island, which is a fabulous novel that continues is a Hungry Tide, The Hungry Tide. This other beautiful novel that is one of them, actually the favorite novels of eco-critics and students that approach this field. So I would like you to tell me more about this relationship with Amitav Ghosh and perhaps something about this program of artists and writers in residence that you have in Venice.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Well, working with Amitav Ghosh has been a very exciting experience. And I mean, as a reader, I've been a fan of his since I started reading him in the late 90s. And then I got to know him through his wonderful Italian translator, Anna Nadotti, and discuss his works with colleagues and mutual friend Carmen Concilio, who's another post-colonialist who's sort of opened my eyes on the relationship between post-colonial and environmental studies. So it in a way started by chance, because we invited Amitav Ghosh as a writer in residence some years ago, and we invited him to write about the ghetto of Venice. That is a place that features prominently in the novel. So initially, the environmental connection was not direct. So we really wanted him to be one who was actually the first of many writers who came to explore the meaning of the word ghetto that has become a global metaphor in relation to the place that originated this infamous or notorious and very famous term, ghetto. And when Amitav Ghosh came to Venice, he discovered, much to his surprise, that the fruit and vegetable vendors in the streets of Venice were speaking his language. And because they were from Bangladesh, they were basically ecological migrants or refugees from Bangladesh. And that was a connection that is also explored. A few years later, in 2016, I read his seminal book, The Great Derangement. And I admire his courage in admitting, the great novelist that he is, that the novel has somehow failed to account for the magnitude of global climate change and of the environmental crisis. And he says, that the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and a crisis of the imagination. And so that book, The Great Derangement, has been a great inspiration for us in building the master's degree. And the novel, when it came out, and of course, I'm happy to remind the people who are listening to us now that part of this series, there is a conversation between Amitav Ghosh and our students who have been reading his novels and now ask him questions. So Ghosh was able to bring together a new representation of Venice into the novel that in the same breath addresses the impact of sea level rise on the city, Acqua Alta, but not just an everyday phenomenon as a global phenomenon or as a symptom of a global phenomenon, and the phenomena of migration. So one of the things that many people don't really fully grasp is that, among other things, the environmental crisis will displace millions of people, and that will contribute to mass migration. And so we really need to be prepared with that. So the model we used was to engage a great intellectual, a great artist, Amitav Ghosh, to guide him through Venice and through the many facets of the city and let him explore and make discoveries. And the great thing is that now he has shown something to us as Venetians. And so this is something that we want to explore again. So to work together, putting together intellectual, scientists, and artists. But of course, you know this very well because Venice has also been an important place for you. So you've written very eloquently about Venice. And I would like to ask you about your relationship with our city, because, Venice means a lot to you.
It does, definitely. So with Venice, I have to say I'm a late starter because I came to Venice as an already mature person. So and Venice, of course, overwhelmed me and overwhelms me all the time. Eco-criticism in the way I see it as a reading key for environmental phenomena and literature is not only something which helps us better read narrative texts. So eco-criticism for me is also a key to consider the world itself as a text, as an eloquent text. And therefore, such a complex reality as Venice is an amazing text that tells you so many stories. And of course, it speaks of the relationship between the people that first contributed to the creation of this place, then to the management of this place, and then today to perhaps the fact that this place has lost its narrative dimension in the eyes of those, for example, of politicians, of politics, and the world in many respects. So Venice tells us a story of hybridity because it was created out of actually a combination of sea and land, and this hybrid textuality has been the one of the guiding lights for those who have actually ruled Venice until the Austrian came in the game. So, of course, during the Renaissance and the 17th century, Venice was actually an object of continuous intervention. And there's a wonderful book about Venice, which has been written by Piero Bevilacqua, Venezia e le acque, una metafora planetaria. So it has been translated, I think. So Venice and waters, a planetary metaphor. And a planetary metaphor, because it is local and global at the same time. And Bevilacqua, in this wonderful book, tells the story of how, for example, the magistrates of the waters were able to take care of this hybrid text, managing, for example, the flow of river water into the lagoon. Because when you have a lagoon, you risk two things. You might risk that the city of Venice, which is an artificial reality, might be overwhelmed by water, or you risk that it might be overwhelmed by river sediment. So, and for example, in the 17th century, hydraulic engineers diverted the course of 7 rivers in order for Venice not to be buried by sediments. And of course, every measure was oriented to the preservation of this very unstable and delicate balance. So Venice had a precise textuality, so they were able to read this hybridity and to act accordingly. That was really a form of precious wisdom, which got completely lost when, after the Campo Formio Treaty of 1797, Napoleon, again, another stranger to this reality, so bequeathed Venice to the Austrians in exchange of territories in the Netherlands. So, and the Austrians didn't really wanted to understand the territory of Venice. And so they pretended to see a city, whereas there was Venice, no other definition possible. And they started reclaiming lands from the water, and we know how much the lagoon needs to expand. It is a sort of a lung that needs to breathe. If you enclose part of the lagoon, of course, water cannot go anywhere. It doesn't have this lung doesn't work anymore. So they reclaim territories, for example, for fisheries, or for agriculture. And of course, the highest peak of this misunderstanding of the textuality was when an industrial site just in front of Venice, in Porto Marghera, was built. And that was actually at the beginning of the 20th century. Thanks to Conte Volpi di Misurata, so La Coppa Volpi, the Volpi Cup at the film festival.
Yeah.
Still brings his name. But anyway, the idea of building a petrochemical site, I'm accelerating, of course, also in terminology. So the idea of building a massive industrial site in front of Venice, with all the impact in ecological, social, and landscape terms, was opened one of the scariest wounds in the body of this hybrid and delicate text. And of course, at that point, other stories emerged. And among these stories, there are also the stories of the many workers of the petrochemical factory that were, of course, we were quoting Portnoy, and actually this difference between who screws and who gets screwed is the principle of environmental justice.
Exactly.
Because there is no such thing as a free meal in nature, as Barry Commoner used to say. But this means that when someone gets rich by exploiting people and living beings, there is someone who is suffering. And the workers in Marghera had a very hard time in having their rights acknowledged, and of course they are still paying the price. And I would like to remember the figure of Gabriele Bortolozzo, who was actually one of the workers that opened also the pathway for something which we might call citizen science. in Venice. So an activist, someone who taught himself medicine in order to help his colleagues at the petrochemical factory. And so today, the story of Venice, of course, is a story of a city overwhelmed by tourism, by global warming. And there is also another book that tells this story, and it is Salvatore Setti's If Venice Dies. So if Venice dies, we really lose a piece of our imagination and of our reality, which is pretty much the way.
Well, thank you for mentioning that book. Before I say something about it, let me also refer our viewers to another of our dialogues that is specifically concerned with the history of Marghera, the conversation between Marco Armiero and Gilda Zazzara, who from the point of view of environmental history have really emphasized the importance of Marghera for the larger context of Venetian history. Of course, I love the definition that we need to read the world as a text that you've used. I think this really speaks to the heart of the environmental humanities. And for people who are sort of perhaps, if not skeptical, don't really understand the importance or the relevance for this point of view, I would mention that you've managed to write about Venice and the pandemics before it happened, because a lot of things you've written about Thomas Mann and Death in Venice, you're rereading of a classic of Venetian literature. You know, Death in Venice is one of the most frequently quoted texts about Venice, but I had never read, of course I don't know all the criticism about it, but I have never read an essay that actually addressed that as a text about pandemic. And I should mention that when we entered lockdown and we had to move our teaching online, your essay about Venice that included that brilliant reading of Thomas Mann was the first reading I share with the students, and it meant a lot to them. So I find this as an eloquent example of how writing about literature from an environmental humanities perspective can suddenly become an instrument to understand the reality, such as being locked in your house and dealing with a pandemic. So even the pandemics is a sort of part of the symptom of the larger environmental crisis. And a quick comment on Salvatore Setti's. Salvatore Setti's If Venice Dies, I think it's a very important book. And for us, it's also an inspiration because it claims that thinking about the future of Venice is not just about the future of the city. It's really about the future of the idea of the city. And I think we're trying to invest a lot in this idea that Venice is a sort of paradigmatic city for against the generic city that is emerging everywhere, the destruction of landscape, of the heritage, but a way to rethink the future. Since you have, already offered so much in terms of how we can reconfigure our relationship with the landscape, but also with the literary canon, can I ask you a very practical question about your teaching activities? How do you introduce your students to the environmental humanities, to eco-criticism? What do you like as the really primary text? What are the first texts that you like your American students to read to open up this wonderful and also sort of a troubling world of the environmental crisis?
Wow. So I can refer to the recent experiences I had with my, let's say, with my undergraduates. I prefer to start with the undergraduates. Also because they come without many prejudices. You see, some graduates perhaps are already familiar with eco-criticism a little bit, and so they expect something. But also with them, I try to transform their expectations. So as you were, again, very generously saying, the idea of eco-criticism as a reading of reality, of the world as a text, is something as a fixation in my head. And so therefore, I have been introducing eco-criticism to them by showing pictures and stories of the world and trying to invite them to elicit the stories behind these events. So we started with for example, the fires in Australia or Acqua Alta in Venice. And I have to say that one of the first texts that I invite my students to think with is Venice. So, and I have to say that, for example, this short but impeccable and beautiful article you wrote on the New York Times, Waters Close Over Venice, has been a really good tool, teaching tool for us, because you say so many things in that open editorial. Of course, you talk about Acqua Alta, you talk about, and therefore, global warming, over tourism, the problems of everyday Venetians, and of course, the crisis of imagination that we will go toward if we, of course, lose Venice. And I think that this is a perfect introduction to a discourse on Venice, on the imagination of a city, which is also a literary imagination. And you quoted Thomas Mann, but we can, of course, quote Andrea Zanzotto. So we can quote Italo Calvino, for example. The invisible cities are all, as Marco Polo says to Kublai Khan, a sort of variation on the theme of Venice. So how many cities are hidden inside this impossible city? So actually, so I start with Venice, and of course, through Venice, we see so many other things. And another text which is very dear to my heart, I have to say, is Aldo Leopold's Ascent County Almanac, which is totally different from Thomas Mann or other Italian texts. But Ascent County Almanac is the story of the experience of Aldo Leopold, who is considered to be the father of environmental ethics, so the land ethics. Aldo Leopold was a wildlife management professor at the University of Wisconsin. And he writes this beautifully poetic, lyrical book, Ascent County Almanac, in which he tells the story of a very small portion of Wisconsin, in which he had what he called the shack, so a little house, where actually he experienced the seasons and the stories of the territory. For example, there is a beautiful episode in February titled Good Oak, in which he tells the story of this old oak, which has been struck by a lightning, and of course they have to cut to fell this oak, and so he tells the story of the place and of the country, ring after. So as they cut across the body of this big oak. So ring after ring, he says, now we are cutting across the ear of the Great Depression. Now we are cutting across the ear of the Dust Bowl. Now we are in this year, the last passenger pigeon died in a zoo in Cincinnati. So this is also a way to tell the story of a country and tell the story of a place through an individual which absorbs the stories of the world. So also an oak can be actually the storyteller for this emerging phenomenon.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for this, because my thinking about this whole sort of panoply of ideas, themes, and concepts, what I came to realize very late is that, unlike what I assumed before, being an eco-critic is not necessarily about writing or thinking about just only wild nature, vast spaces. But in fact, I believe that we can try to train students to read eco-critically their familiar spaces, urban spaces, small spaces. Every single corner can be read eco-critically.
Yeah.
And so that's it's not about nature writing. I mean, whatever we call nature is everywhere. And then we understand that it's in itself a problematic sense. Well, you've given a good example of how you start with undergraduates. But since you're also and always been a sort of at the cutting edge of new directions of scholarship, can you tell us where do you think, from your perspective, in terms of graduate research or advanced research, where are the environmental humanities heading from your perspective? What are the new or urgent concepts, themes, ideas that we should explore and trying to investigate?
Well, that's a great question, and I would say they are heading towards Venice, of course. But
everybody's welcome. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that we really need to think more about what we have in order not to lose it, for example. And Venice is at the top of the list, I think. And if I might add something to what you were saying just some moment ago, so wild nature is perhaps the most problematic word in every language, as Raymond Williams taught us, actually. And wilderness can mean so many things. There are actually wilderness can be in the cancer cells of a body. So wilderness can be hidden in your stinky cheese, for example, which you savor so much, because of course these things are wild, they are alive. Wilderness can be the climate, in the climate. It can be in an earthquake. So there are so many forms of wilderness. Can also be in the suburbs, and in the riots, or in the struggles, in the violence that we experience every day. So don't we think that, for example, this aggression based on racial prejudices is wild? So this is what I see as a form of wilderness, actually. So this is the bad wilderness. And then, of course, there is this fascinating wilderness, which is most of a myth than a reality, of course. And it's also, of course, very problematic, and should be examined as an ideology, because it's an exclusionary ideology. And of course, India is one of the places where and Amitav Ghosh, for example, in The Hungry Tide, life of tigers versus the life of human beings. Who is more valuable? Shall we preserve? What kind of wilderness shall we preserve? What does it mean, wilderness? So it's very, very problematic. And we learned this also thanks to post-colonial scholars, as a matter of fact. But anyway, so you were asking me about the directions. And I think that...
new directions of research.
So perhaps the idea of wilderness meaning so many things can also lead us to think about the many meanings of the word culture. And for example, we think of culture as separated from nature. But there is a very, very important field of research which tells us exactly the opposite. And to me, this field is perhaps one of the most important of the environmental debate, biosemiotics, for example. So biosemiotics is a field within biology, and it's, of course, as a conversation between biology and cultural studies, or literary studies, biology or philosophy, actually philosophy of science, epistemology. So as biologists say, and can of course confirm, information is the basic unit of life. In our cells, we have a semiotic activity. So signs are everywhere. And of course, life develops as an interpretation of these signs that produce meanings that are, of course, functionally interpreted within the cells. So DNA is a code. But it doesn't mean anything if it is not interpreted by the proteins of the RNA. So, and there is a conversation from the smallest units of life to, of course, the conversation that we are having here. There is no fracture. There is a continuity, a formal continuity and a material continuity. And of course, evolution also follows these rules, because it's, of course, a sort of expanding of this conversation, which is the essence or the gist of life itself. And so theory of complexity and other theories, of course, confirm that at a certain point, from within these conversations, new realities emerge, the theory of emergence. So the mind emerges from matter. So it's a sort of creation of meanings that it has a very biological basis. So biosemiotics opens our eyes on this reality, which is a continuity between nature and culture. And of course, it's also a continuity between the freedom that is within our smallest living units, our cells, because there is a conversation between the cells and among themselves and with the environment. So there is no determinism in this respect. Everything is a sort of an exploration and an open conversation. So this freedom, which has been called by one of the foremost scholars, Jasper Hoffmeyer, semiotic freedom, is actually the way life develops. And semiotic freedom is also something which we need to develop our cultural discourses. So in regimes, the repression of freedom, of intellectual freedom, of personal freedom is also something very bad for democracy. So you see, there is a very important continuity between these things. And therefore, I think biosemiotics is also an open field. But there are many open fields. There is the field of multi-species ethnography, for example, which of course considers anthropology as a part of a larger discourse in which our culture and our expressions are actually a sort of negotiation between us and other species, species that are not necessarily animals, but also plants, for example.
Plants, right, yeah.
There are other fields like, for example, empirical eco-criticism, which is very much associated with affect theories and trauma studies, for example. So this intersection between psychology and literary studies. And of course, environmental justice. Environmental justice is always at the cutting edge of every research, I think, because we really need an ethical dimension to understand what also the meaning of what we are doing. Otherwise, it's only a performance, and we don't want to do that. If there is a big difference between what we do and what other disciplines do, is this ethical commitment. I think this is something that post-colonial studies has understood in a very early phase of its development.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you also for mentioning certain very urgent themes that are being addressed in other conversations in the same series. For instance, the relationship between racism and environmentalism is being addressed by Ijaba Shego and Antonella Bundu in their conversation, and the specific ethics of plants is explored in the conversation between Alessandra Viola and Jonathan Key. In conclusion, because we don't have, unfortunately, a lot of time left, we are supposed to recommend a book that has been inspiring. And in fact, I've already mentioned the book because your seminal essay on Venice, Cognitive Justice and the Truth of Biology appears in this illuminating volume called Eco-Criticism in Italy. And really, I recommend it to all readers who are interested in understanding eco-criticism, and also readers are interested in rereading landscapes that may be fairly familiar, because you write about Naples, you write about L'Aquila, you write, of course, about Venice. And I think this is a wonderful example of one can write very eloquently, very clearly also. I mean, you also managed to be a very clear and profound writer. And really, you defamiliarize certain familiar places and help us to navigate certain well-known topics, but also to shed new light. So thank you for writing this, and will be recommended to all our students. Do you have a book to recommend to conclude our conversation?
Well, since we are talking about biosemiotics, I'd like to recommend this seminal book by Wendy Wheeler, The Whole Creature, Complexity, Biosemiotics, and the Evolution of Culture, in which she actually explains in a very effective way what biosemiotics is, and how it's actually a development that we can recognize in our political and social dimension. So I was talking about the semiotic freedom, which is a concept that was developed by Jasper Hofmeyr as the activity of cellular life. But Wendy Wheeler has the capacity of following the development of this concept up to our social and political sphere. So this means that we have so much in common with everything alive, and that we really can see that culture is not specifically human, and that nature is not specifically non-human. So I think that we really need these sort of bridges to understand the meaning of what we do in our field. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, Serenella Ivino, we look forward to welcoming you back in Venice.
Can't
wait. To talk again in multiple ways and to make new discoveries thanks to your scholarship. Thank you very much for being with you. Bye.
Thank you, Charles.